And welcome again to our Behdini Beginners course. Today we're going to be working on Class 18, which is Lesson 8, and we're going to run through sections A through F. Now this is a little bit different than we've done before because this time it focuses on the past tense. I'm going to be using the Zaho dialect book for this lesson, because it's more consistent with the past tense. I'll point out when the Dehuk version is a little bit different. So to get started, let's look at page 167, lesson 8, and we're going to start with these personal stories. So in part 1 here, our title is Shbedi as Hatem Kurdistani. And in English, we think of that as before I came to Kurdistan. Now, I am not going to read through all of this. You have the audio recordings, and you can get the link to these audio recordings in lesson 1 on page 2. But I'm just going to point out some of the grammatical things because the focus of this lesson is on the simple past tense of intransitive verbs. And we will get to all of that, but I'm just going to point out some things now, and later we'll get to the details. So in the Zaho dialect, they would say, before I came, as Hatem. So there's your as, which is your subject, and then hat, which is your past stem, and then your verb ending, which is im. Now, briefly, let's just go look at the Dehuki version. And this is not past tense, but this is how they say it in Kurdistan. Beri az behema Kurdistani. And so I have put came in quotations because that is not what it says, but that's what it means. Behema is actually subjunctive 1. And we'll get to that in lesson 10. Okay, I'm just going to point that out right now. So if you're learning the Tehuki dialect, you want to go ahead and say it this way, but just realize it's not past tense. I put it in the past tense lesson because that's where it falls the way we think of things in English. Okay, so in section A here, you can listen to all of these. You're listening to each of these little characters' stories, and you can read them in English. This goes on for quite a while. And part 2 on page 169, you are learning the different countries of the world as best as we can figure them out in Kurdish. And then in part 3, you're focusing on some of the camps and the cities. And there's a little map there for you to get an idea of where some of those are. These are the different cities of Kurdistan down at the bottom of this page. Then in section B on page 170, you have conversation and role play. And again, I'm going to point out some of these past tense things. So, for example, the first one, Hin Chawa Chun Baghdad. How did you go to Baghdad? And this is your past tense verb right here. Now, in the Tehuki dialect, they would say Hin Chawa Chuna. And it's got that little at the end. Sorry, I didn't go very clearly. It's got that little at the end. And that's what Tehukis do. That doesn't have anything to do with past tense. It has to do with this verb, the verb go. They're going to put that little on the end. All right, back to the Zaho dialect. One of the things that you'll run across when you use the verb go in the past tense, so went, is how you go. So it passe, like by bus. It custere, by small bus. It rafe, by minibus. So when you do these, just keep in mind that this b is oftentimes pronounced ip or p. We do write it bi, but it's oftentimes not pronounced that way. So that's just a pronunciation mark. Lots of information here. Go through this slowly with your language helper, with the audio recordings, so that you can absorb it. In section C, we just have a pronunciation thing of phrases and words that you'll find in this lesson. Go ahead and use the audio recordings to go through that. And then in part 2, take turns with your friend or your language helper to work through the little game there. Follow the arrows. In section D, it's the vocabulary, and this is full of new vocabulary. So again, just work through this slowly with the audio recordings, with your language helper. Now the verbs, let's take a look at some of the verbs. In this lesson, we are focused on the intransitive verbs. This is really important that you realize it's intransitive verbs, because in the past tense, we use regular sentence construction with intransitive verbs and ergative sentence construction with transitive verbs in the past tense. So what are intransitive verbs? Intransitive verbs are verbs that don't have an object. There is no object. An adjective is not an object. So you could say, I became a doctor, but it's actually a noun, but it's not an adjective. It's not an object, not with the verb to be. If you have, like, you're going to gather something in English, we would think of that something as an object. But in Kurdish, it's the object of a preposition, not the object of the sentence. And so this verb, because it has been biba as its base, qualifies as an intransitive verb. We'll get to that. I'm just pointing some things out here. So this first section here shows you all the verbs that use been biba or bun biba as the base. In the second section here, these are verbs that use haten, be, weta, or come as the base. Next section, it uses man, bamina as the base, and so on. A few differences between dialects, between Zaho and Dahuk dialect here. And then you have these varieties down here, which don't seem to be the base for anything. They're just verbs by themselves. And these are also intransitive verbs. Now you would think, to understand, I understand you, I understand that, what you said, you would think that is a transitive verb, but it's not. And again, it's because the thing that you understand is a preposition, or the object of a preposition. So it qualifies as an intransitive verb. Sorry, getting used to my new computer. Okay, so we're going to also just look at this euphemism here for he died. Kurds don't like to talk about people dying. So if you're going to refer to someone that died, like your neighbor that died or someone's father that died years and years ago, after you talk about it, you're going to say Amre Khode Kid, which literally means the age of God did. Or you're going to say he went to the heart of God. Chu Dilovania Khode. And these are euphemisms for talking about someone who died. Some little comparisons which are helpful to have when you're learning right here. So par means last year. Per means the day before yesterday. Per means a page or a feather. And pais means autumn. So as you're learning this new vocabulary, make sure you make these comparisons so that you remember what's what. The thing that is always tricky for me to remember is Friday versus a mosque versus the university. These are hard for me to get. So I always have to think carefully about this. Jami'ah, Jam'ah, Jum'ah. All right, lots of vocabulary here. Take your time. Now, in section E, you're going to use your audio recordings for this. And in section F, at the bottom of page 176, this is where we're going to focus our attention for the remainder of this lesson. So we're talking first about Kurdish verbs. And Kurdish verbs have two parts. They have an infinitive and they have an imperative. So in the dictionary, the infinitive is listed first. I have a mistake here. And the imperative is listed second. It should be rina. Should have an E on the end of it. Rina. Rinishten, rina. And it's very important to learn your verb as a whole when you memorize the vocabulary, not just one part of the verb. Next page. Basic verbs can also be added to form new verbs. So for example, you take rinishten, rina. Let me go see if my Dehookie version is correct. And then we won't have to do the corrections all the time. Yeah, it's correct in my Dehookie version. So I'm going to look at the Dehookie version here. Okay, so you can form new verbs. So, for example, you take a basic verb, rinishten, rina. That means to sit. And then if you want to make it say sit down, then you add, for example, khor, rinishten khor, or rina khor. Notice that the addition is usually a word or phrase, which is added to both the infinitive and the imperative. In this exercise, you're going to put a box around the basic infinitives and imperatives, and then you're going to underline the additions. So let's look at the first one, the first section. What's the basic infinitive and imperative? So that would be boon biba or bean biba in the Zaho dialect. Okay, I'm switching back to Zaho. And then bean biba. Okay, so that's your basic infinitive and imperative. And that just simply means to be or to become. Now, if we want to say to be careful, we add this word hishior. to both the infinitive and the imperative. And that doesn't change how the verb is treated as an intransitive verb. It's just making it a different verb. And then you have to come together or to gather. Cum, being. Cum, biba. So that's how you do it. Go ahead and do this section on your own. Check your answers in the answer key in book B in Appendix S, I believe it is. Okay, now look at part 2. Infinitive and past stem of a verb. Okay, so how is the past tense of a verb formed? All right, there's a formula for this. You start with the past stem of the verb, and then you add a past tense verb ending, and that makes a past tense verb. In all of my books, all of my grammar charts, the past stem is represented by a black box. In order to form the past stem of a verb, you start with the infinitive and you drop the IN ending and you get the past stem. So if the infinitive ends in anything besides IN or N, you don't drop it. Okay. So Rinischen ended in IN. Great. Okay, so we drop the IN. Mon, Bamina, ends in N. So you drop that N and you get ma as your past stem. Next page. Let's look at a tricky one. And this is an exercise that you need to do. The first thing that you do is you write the infinitive and then you drop the IN or N and write the past stem. So in number 1, here's your verb, bun biba, or bean biba. So you write your infinitive, you just copy it straight up. From here, you just copy it. And then you take that infinitive and you drop that N or IN, and then that becomes your past stem. Okay, so you're going to do that for all of these. Now let's look at one that might be a little tricky, that might trick you up. Okay, let's look at number 15. Borin bebora means to rain. So this is your infinitive. What are you going to drop to make the past stem? You are only dropping the N. Eyes with hats are not eyes with dots. Same thing with number 13. Eyes with hats are not eyes with dots. So you do not drop that eye with a hat. That stays as a part of the past stem. Let's look at number 20. Let's look at number 19. Okay, so rinishten hor is your infinitive. And in this case, the infinitive is not at the end of the verb phrase, it's at the beginning. So you just ignore the hor. Just ignore the hor. Right there. Just ignore that part. And you're going to work with the infinitive. So you drop the IN and you just keep the hor as a part of it. And that's your past stem after you drop your IN. Same thing with zivanin va. The va just goes along for the ride. In 24, take a heshtin, you have this prepositional phrase at the beginning, te. That just goes along for the ride. You don't change it at all. Same thing in 25. Shchau just goes along for the ride. What you do change is the rabin or rabun. Get the past stem. All right, now let's look at part 3. This is page 179. Now we're going to talk about verb endings. Okay. So in order to form the past tense of a verb, to say I came, for example, you have to have a verb ending. So once you get your past stem, which is represented by the black box, you add a verb ending to it. And in intransitive verbs, you use regular sentence construction. And your subject let's see if I can do this. The subject agrees with your verb ending. In intransitive verbs in the past tense. So let's practice that. Let's look at the little chart. You're going to practice making sentences using the verb endings chart below and the chart in your book B, Appendix J. It's all the same. So in the chart, you see your direct case subjects. And you see where the past stem goes. That goes next. You have to have a verb ending. So the first verb ending, for example, is for past stems that end in a consonant. The second verb ending, that one, for example, is for stems that end in a vowel. How do you remember that? There are 2 ways to remember it. One is just logic. If you have a verb, a past stem that ends in a vowel, you don't want the vowel in the past stem to be right next to a vowel in the ending. So you're not going to use that one. You're going to use the consonant. And if your past stem ends in a consonant, like n, then you want to have a vowel as a part of the verb ending, so that 2 vowels are not together, and so 2 consonants are not together. Now, that is unavoidable in the case of past stems that end in a vowel with this ending, because they're the same, or with this ending, because they're the same. But with these that are different, you have a choice. That's one way to remember it. The other way to remember it is that you think C for consonant. This is the consonant ending here. And V for vowel. These are the past stems that end in vowel endings here. And in the English language, C comes before V. Okay, so if you open up your book B to Appendix J, you will see this chart. Or you can just look at it in this book. But if you want it big, look at it in your book B. And here you see your direct case subjects and your past stems, which are represented by the black box over here. And then you have your verb endings. Now, in your book B, you have a strip that you can lift up to see what's on the chart itself, which is the consonant ending, or you can lay the strip down to see the verb ending and what the vowel ending. And when I say vowel ending, I mean when the past stem ends in a vowel. Here's some examples. We went to Zako. Okay, so to, let me see, let me do it this way. So to is your past stem. To is your past stem. Let's see if I can get my stuff to work here. Okay, to is your past stem. And then in is your verb ending, which agrees with your subject. And then in the Tehuki dialect, you add this at the end. You don't do that in the Zako dialect. And then if you want to negate it, you put the na before the verb. And notice, Tehuki speakers, that there's no at the end in a question. All right, let's do another one. So their friend came. Now this time, Havale won. That whole thing is the subject. Havale won is like saying he. So that would be this, he. And then you have your past stem. So hot is the past stem. And then you have to do your verb ending. And the verb ending is what I call the nothing verb ending. That's it. There is no verb ending. Now let's look at we learned Kurdish. We think of Kurdish as an object. But footnote 3 says this verb is intransitive even though it seems to have an object, Kurdi. A parallel, also intransitive, parallel verb is ferbun, ferbiba. The opposite verb, which is transitive, is ferkirin, ferbika, and that means to teach instead of to learn. And you'll find it interesting that Kurds will oftentimes mix up teach and learn, like, will you learn me English? When they really mean to say, will you teach me English? They'll do that sometimes, and part of that is from this. So on the next page, in part 4, you're going to write past tense sentences with intransitive verbs. Write the meanings in your first language or English, and then check them with your helper. Be sure to use your chart to help you do these correctly. Please don't try to memorize it yet. Do it correctly from the chart first, and then you can memorize it later. So here are a couple of examples. So what's the verb for was or became? You have to use been biba or boon biba, okay? So here's your past stem, boo or be in the Zako dialect, and then your verb ending is sorry. Let me switch back to the Zako. Okay, so here's your past stem, be or boo in the Tohoki dialect. And then your verb ending is and you know that because your subject is us. Now I want to show you something about this verb. So being biba or boon biba. This means to be or to become. Okay, how do you know when it means to be, and how do you know when it means to become? So in the present tense, we learned this in lesson 1. And in the past tense, which we're learning right now, if it means to be, then the adjective or the noun comes at the end of the sentence. So in the present tense, you could say, I am teacher. And that looks like this, as mamusta ma. That's present tense. Okay? For past tense, you would say, I was teacher. And that looks like this, as mamusta boo ma. So boo is your past stem. And is your verb ending. Now, if I want to say I become or I became a teacher, let's do it in past tense. I became. You say as boom almost stop. And the teacher part comes at the end of this sentence. Normally in Kurdish is subject, object, verb. And it's not an object with this verb, but normally the verb comes last, like it does with this. But with this verb, when it means became instead of was, then the verb goes immediately after the subject. And then the noun or adjective comes at the end of the sentence. Right, and the next one on page 180, we have the verb for was afraid. Okay, so here's our verb stem. Tercia. There's our verb stem, past stem. And then the verb ending is "-ine." And that agrees with your subject. We. Okay, so use your chart. Use your vocabulary list in section D to get the verbs. And use your chart on page 179 to know how to do these. You've done that, and when you've checked these with your language helper or your friend, then you can play this game, part 5 on page 182, where you say a past tense sentence and then you place your mark. You try to get 4 squares in a row. Okay, so here's your list of intransitive verbs. And so, for example, you want to say something with hungry. Okay, so you could say, I was hungry. Okay, so you want to put a mark here. So before you can do that, you have to say a sentence. So you could say, as bersih boom, or bean. As bersih bean. After I say my sentence, I put my mark. All right, and then my language helper, they can't make a mark here, so they can try to block me by saying something like, chun, I went. So I could say, the hungry man went. Okay. Zalame bersi chu. All right, so that was my sentence. So I can put a check mark or something to show that it's a different person. Okay, that person has been blocked now. Anyway, that's how you play the game. Try to get 4 in a row. And you can do it later with someone else. And that's the end of this lesson. And the next lesson we'll start with section G. Okay, so I just want to go back to your chart. On what page is this? 179. So your chart on page 179, which is the same as Appendix J in your book B, this book B right here. Okay, so your red book B, Appendix J. This is your key to understanding how to make past tense sentences with intransitive verbs. You simply do a direct case subject, you put your past stem, and then you put a verb ending on it. And if you want to make it negative, you put that negator right after the subject. And the tricky one, you know, is like this one when it's a compound verb and it goes in the middle of it before the base part of the verb. Ketin bekava. Okay, if you have any questions, you can always email me. My email address is info@newbridgesbooks.com. to answer your questions. Hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll work on another lesson soon. Y'all have a great day. Bye.